and added it to the word finger for this very rare Annonaceae from Australia. So that's from one flower making a cluster of fruits. The clusters are usually smaller than that, and the individual fingers are usually thinner. But that is a finger sop, Merogini cylindrocarpa. I named it because I had never heard an English name for it, and I never heard an Aboriginal name either. I looked in the literature and couldn't find anything. So I named it, even though I've never been to Australia. And if you walked by the table here, you saw some cut opens one here as well. Another name for the Annonaceae fruits that are really good is araticum, and that's from the Tupi language in Brazil. And the word ara comes from the call of the macaws. As they fly across the heavens, they're going ara, ara, ara. And so the word ara in Taino means the heavens. And these really good fruits are gifts from the heavens. So, aratikum. Okay, enough about names. We have a subtropical climate here. For years in a row it seems tropical, and then once in a while, like once in a decade, we get reminded that we're actually in the subtropics here because we have a freeze or a near freeze. So some of the Annonaceae fruits do not do well in freezes. The Soursop can actually take a degree or two below freezing if it isn't being blown upon by wind. It dislikes cold wind so much that even at 43 degrees, 11 degrees above freezing, the soursop will lose all its leaves. Soursops are supposed to be evergreen. They're never supposed to go dormant. And when they lose all their leaves, they have no sense. They're not adapted to this sort of situation. The plant does not know what to do. Now, I'm talking as though the plant's a human. Plants don't have brains or spinal cords or even nervous systems, but they do process information. Each part of the plant processes the information that part of the plant needs. But the soursop has no genetic adaptation for dealing with cold. So once all the leaves drop, it immediately bursts out in new growth. Now, a plant that's adapted to cold weather is not going to do that. It's going to wait until there's no cold for quite a few days or weeks before it leaves out again. Not the soursop. It buds out immediately. And if you get another cold blast, it's going to drop all those leaves. And after about 4 buddings out, it'll be out of buds and out of energy and may die without ever having gotten close to freezing. So, soursops do best planted on the east side or south side of a 1-story at least, or preferably 2-story building, or large trees that also have hedges and so on all the way to the ground, and so there's no cold wind blowing through. And then the soursop will do very well. Unlike most of these other species, soursop can be grown in wet locations. At Tropical Research and Education Center, they put like 2-gallon or 3-gallon soursop plants, just like this, into 5-gallon buckets of stagnant water. And the plants suddenly drooped and looked bad for about a week, and then they gradually came out of it and looked normal again. And at the end of the year, the experiment was terminated because those plants were never going to be sick from being in water too long. Even though it was not running water, not well oxygenated water, just stagnant, algae-filled, yucky water, and yet the plants did fine. So, in other words, if you plant this in a low spot in your yard, or a spot that occasionally floods, that shouldn't be a problem with soursop. I'm going to talk about them both here for a minute. So this one is pond apple. This is native to Florida and to all the warm coast of the Atlantic Ocean on both sides. So it's native from Florida all around over to Mexico, through the Caribbean islands, South America, all the way almost to the southern border of Brazil, almost to Uruguay. And on the other side of the Atlantic, along all the warm coast of Africa. The seeds of the pond apple float on water and are still good a year or more later. I planted them after 1 year of floating on fresh water. The pond apple is not a wonderful fruit. The taste varies a lot. Some are completely tasteless. Some taste like soap. And there are a few that taste good, but have very little to eat, because they're mostly seed, and the pulp sticks to the seeds. But some people do take those better flavored ones and make marmalades or juices by pressing the pulp and seeds against a colander to get some juice out and use that. Now, there actually should be 2 species of pond apple, because some have 1 number of genes and the others have a double number of genes. Or maybe some even triple, I'm not sure. That's called polyploidy, where the whole set of genes get repeated extra times. We grow the pond apple to use as rootstock, so that we can use pond areas, swamp areas, and floodable areas of properties to plant Annonas of other species grafted onto pond apple. But it's complicated because it depends on what tree you get the pond apple seed from. I've already described the genetic variation, and pond apple's very easy to graft onto. I've done many batches where every last graft took. Now, even, those of us who are professional grafters in nurseries, we usually have some plants that die from most batches of anything we graft. But with a pond apple, they would seem to all live. But by the end of 6 months, those on one particular seed batch would all be dead. The grafts had lived, they had grown like 6 inches, and then he stopped and turned yellow and died. And from the seeds from another pond apple tree, all the grafts grew beautifully, and we sold the plants after a year or 2, and they were all just perfect. So it took us a while to figure out what was going on, because I had started just scooping up pond apple seeds that were floating on a pond. I didn't know what tree they were from. And from the first batch of plants, I noticed that some plants had small leaves and some had large leaves. Now this one looks kind of small leaf to me. And as it turned out, the large leaf ones were the ones that our grafts did well on. And the small leaves Some things that we grafted on the small leaf pond apple did okay, but most did not. So if you're getting pond apple seed from an untested source, be sure you mark some identification on the tree that you get the seed from, and mark your seedling batches, keep your plants separate, and do your experiments. And after your first year of experimentation, if you've kept everything separate and kept records, then you know if you have a good one or not to do a bunch of. For sure, don't go selling stuff right away until you have a proven rootstock source. Any question about that? Pond apple rootstock. When grafting these, I wait for the plant to get close to twice this height, and I graft about this high because I want to have some healthy leaves below the graft. And so all the nice pond apple grafts, as rootstocks that I've done, were at least, the grafts are at least a foot above the ground, and some of them 18 inches. And that's also an advantage if you're going to plant it in a swampy area, so when the water comes up, it isn't actually touching the graft, just touching the pond apple rootstock, which is used to flooding. Also, I got excellent takes on the graft when I did the grafting where the brown part of the trunk was touching the still green part of the trunk. That transition phase area seemed to receive the grafts well. So back to Soursop. I talked about pond apple because I talked about Soursop being able to work in flooded areas, and pond apple's even better for that. If you help, I can't hold the microphone and this at the same time. So I'm cutting open a ripe Soursop. So this was a reasonably well-pollinated one. The insects actually did the work. So I hadn't cut it open before, and I didn't realize it was going to be discolored inside. So this one has been undergoing drought, and the fruit is not healthy. This should be perfectly glistening white. None of this grayish-brown color should be here on the inside. And the seeds should be black or very dark brown. And I see some light brown ones here, so those seeds are probably just seed coats and no actual seed inside. In other words, empty seeds.
Still smells good.
Yes. So Soursop can be extremely sour, but some varieties are very sweet with a nice amount of tartness mixed in. So those are preferred for eating as dessert fruits. And the extremely sour ones, most people prefer not to eat out of hand, but make juices, more of the nectar style of juice, or use them in various prepared foods. The texture is fibrous. So there's at least one variety that's called fiberless. It's not 100% fiberless, but it's way less fibrous than the others. You need to remember that most of these species have a high amount of variation within the species. So that's particularly the case with Soursop. I've already described the fact that some have more fiber, some less, some are more sour, some are more sweet. They're also marked differences in the aroma. I once went to a conference where some doctors from the experiment station at Mayagüez had tested the components of the aroma of soursop fruits. And they found at least 13 different components of the aroma, and the fruits of some soursop varieties were completely lacking in that aroma. I mean, one of those aromas. And the concentrations of the others would vary a lot. So eventually they did a synthetic soursop aroma to help make sure that all the canned juices being sold had a nice aroma. So instead of speaking of one subject like soil or pollination about everything, we'll do it one by one. So, as I said, the bugs did a reasonably good job of pollinating that fruit that we cut open. It was nicely symmetrical. But this is more typical of the work that the bugs do. They don't get the pollen well spread. So the inside of the flower, it's kind of a donut shape. The donut is actually male. That's where the anthers are. And what would be the hole in the donut is actually a raised sticky area that is the female parts. And you need to remember that there's somewhere between 80 and 120 female parts there. And so when the pollination is done thoroughly, then you get more seeds and you get a much larger fruit that will be symmetrical and more tasty. You see, the seeds emit growth regulator hormones that improve the quality of the pulp. So some people want seedless fruit, like seedless watermelons, but have some of you noticed that seedless watermelons often don't taste quite as rich as the seedy ones? Well, that's going to be the same with soursop and other Annonas. You would normally want to have at least a few good seeds in there. You know, flat, empty seeds will not be of any help. Now, if you came and looked at these on the table, you notice that this curved soursop, that's curved because of the incomplete pollination. The pollen was put in one part of the female area, not the other part. But this fruit is also covered with scale. It was running with ants, which I blew off to not bring a bunch of ants here. But the scale is still there, and the ants are normally tending the scale, tickling the scale to get honeydew from the scale to eat, and the ants return the favor by carrying the crawlers of the scales, you know, the scales babies, to new locations. So it's a symbiotic cooperation. A plant that's dirty like this, just teeming with insect life, tends to get pollinated. If you spray your soursop trees and keep them completely glistening clean, you'll need to do the bug work yourself. Soursop flowers have pollen available well after sunset, like towards the end of dusk. So if you keep your tree really beautiful and clean and really healthy, and you pollinate it, and you'll be able to do a better job than the bugs do, then you can get soursop fruit that are 18 inches long and, you know, like 9 or 10 inches across. Just gorgeous. So people go down to Costa Rica and Colombia and buy a beautiful, huge soursop like that and bring the seeds home and think that, you know, that they have a superior genetics and they're going to get wonderful fruit. and then they get fruit like this. Because I'm sure there's some genetic variation that contributes to the size of the fruit, but it's the health of the tree, you know, fertilizer, being in full sun, which they do need to be in full sun, and well watered, you know, good mineral supply, and then the good thorough pollination to get the really big fruits. Any question about soursops? Paul?
There's the seeds and the skin, they say is toxic. What about the pulp? Is that toxic as well?
Yeah, that's a whole other subject that's getting away a bit from growing soursops, but I admit that one of the reasons that a lot of people grow soursop is because someone in the family has cancer and they think that, you know, the soursop's going to help cure it. Not only soursop, but as far as I know, just about any of these other Annonas, certainly the sugar apple and the custard apple, and the soursop and mountain soursop are quite active with compounds that are called Annonaceae alkaloids, or annonaceous alkaloids. These are poisons. Now, remember, most cancer treatments are done with poisons because the application of the poisons to the body is to kill the cancer cells. And hopefully your poison is more likely to be absorbed by the cancer cells than by the healthy cells in the body. And often that is the case because the cancer cells are more actively sucking in nutrients. But you have to remember, it's a poison. So taking teas from the leaves of soursop or custard apple or some of these others, it helps you sleep, it helps with this and that. There are many claims for it in home remedy medicines, but people who do this on a frequent basis can end up with atypical Parkinson's syndrome. If they stop consumption entirely for 1 or 2 years, the symptoms of atypical Parkinson's syndrome go away. So it's not Parkinson's, but you wouldn't really know the difference because you shake so much. Now, the notion that you can use these teas to prevent cancer is crazy because if you don't have cancer cells in you already, what are you trying to kill? Got it? Okay. If you do have cancer, then you probably could care less if you're going to get the shakes because you got to kill the cancer. So you might well want to drink soursop tea then. Now we have another problem. Remember I already talked about how much these species vary? Well, the amount of those medicinal alkaloids in the leaves varies too. From close to 0, so you can have an absolutely useless soursop tree if what you want is leaf tea. And you can have another one that's quite potent. And generally no one is doing the testing to figure out which is which. So we know about the variation in the alkaloids in the leaves because Dr. Jerry McLaughlin of Purdue University decades ago tested many samples and he published the results. But he just tested samples people brought in and then no one knew where the trees were that the samples were taken from. So no one had proven useful trees to get graftwood from and vegetatively propagate to have a soursop grove for medicinal purposes. And these people selling soursop leaf tea, they haven't even heard any of this. they're not crooks, they're just selling actual soursop leaves from actual trees, and they don't know that some of what they're selling is useless and some of it is strong, and who knows which is which. Okay, so it's kind of a conundrum. Michael.
The concentrations also vary seasonally. There's a company called Nature's Sunshine that did a lot of research on the acidogenic chemicals.
In the Yosemite triloba, the northern pawpaw.
And they sell pills in a standardized extract, and that's what most of the research that actually is using these sort of chemicals to treat cancers uses the Yosemite triloba standardized extract. So if you want to know what you're going to get, that's the place to get it.
That is correct. So Nature's Sunshine Products, their supplement, simply labeled pawpaw, is standardized, and that process they learned and developed under the supervision of the researcher that I just mentioned, Dr. Jerry McLaughlin. And so he learned that the twigs of the pawpaw, which were going to be ground up to make the supplements, must be harvested in the month of May. The rest of the year, there wasn't enough concentration to be practical. But just when the new growth was fixing to burst out, then the tree was full of those substances to kill insects with. Yes, it's a poison. Are we finished with that subject? Michael.
I have the Miami.
The Miami variety of soursop.
Then I have the Grafting, and then I have the Whitman's fibrous.
And the Whitman fiberless.
I want a Grafting. Would it? And I have your Har's North pond apple.
Okay.
You say let it get about 18 inches long. Would you graft the soursop?
No, I said I grafted onto pond apple as much as 18 inches above the soil line.
Yeah.
And so the plant has to be a lot bigger for the wood to be
Color change.
the color change and to be strong enough to hold the graft there without just breaking off. So you can't do it up in the tender tip. It'll just break off.
Would you put soursop onto pond apple?
I don't think I ever did put soursop onto pond apple. I don't know what the advantage would be since you can already plant soursop directly into wet spots. Now, maybe planting directly into pond wouldn't work, but soggy soil can work for the soursop to be planted directly into the soil.
I want to graft it to keep the variety.
Yeah.
So that's what I was wondering. What should I put it on? Pond apple?
Well, other soursop, or try it on pond apple. I just am not advising it because I have absolutely no experience doing that.
I thought you might have.
So most good farmers do experiments. So go ahead.
How you doing, Har?
All right.
Question for you. You're talking about the concentration of the chemical in the leaves and stuff. I've noticed because I have a couple of soursop trees, and I just walking by them, I can feel this. I can smell the scent of some of the trees stronger than the others. Does the scent have anything to do with the concentration of that chemical you mentioned?
He mentioned that the scent of soursop leaves varies considerably. Some of them smell like cat pee, real strong, and others you can crush them and there's hardly any smell at all. So this is just another indication of the variability. And I can't answer your question because I don't know if those aromatic properties correlate with the alkaloids.
Is
Paul.
the toxin at all in the pulp, the seeds, or the skin, or is it only the leaves?
The toxin is in the leaves and very strongly is in the seeds and presumably in the roots. I haven't heard that, but the roots smell pretty strong and so on. Is it in the pulp? Yes, in very low concentrations. most of us don't have the luxury of pigging out on these fruit to the amount that we would get a dose. Almost all poisons are dosage dependent. Any other medicinal stuff? We can get back to growing now, right? Okay.
You mentioned that bugs pollinate the soursop.
Yes, pollination of the soursop is not done by natidulid beetles. The natidulid beetles do the sugar apple and Cherimoyas and Elamas, Cherimoyas, what I call the group of true Annonas. The soursop and mountain soursop and many other species, we call that the Guanabani group. I don't know why botanists include both groups in the Anona genus. I prefer to call the soursop Guanabanus muricatus, but the botanists, almost all of them, call it Anona muricata. So this is the mountain soursop. It's not a variety of soursop, it's another species. And I would call it Guanabanus montanus, but most botanists say Anona montana. Now the true soursop, as I said, has glistening white pulp. And the mountain soursop has yellow pulp. And the seeds are golden. Sorry, Paul, I'm moving out of camera range. So the true soursop has black seeds, dark brown seeds, when they're fresh in the fruit. The mountain soursop has golden seeds when they're fresh in the fruit. They do turn a light brown when they dry. By the way, you plant fresh soursop seeds and fresh Anona montana seeds. You don't dry them first, preferably. So if you're saving seeds and sending them to somebody, send them in moist paper towel or something like that. The mountain soursop varies in flavor also, from quite soapy, rather nasty, to some varieties who taste pretty good. This is one that does not taste good. I call this the common sort of mountain soursop. It has been experimented with some for rootstock, but I don't have any, really good information to pass on about that. Mostly it hasn't worked, but has not been extensively tested. So don't necessarily count it out yet. Oh, I talked about soursop being so cold sensitive. Mountain soursop is not. It can take all kinds of winds, hurricanes, cold winds, drought, a little bit of flooding, not as good as soursop. And it can take several degrees below freezing if the tree is well established. A little seedling like this might be killed by a freeze. Now the custard apple, Anona reticulata. Here's a lovely example of the fruit here. They can get like 2 or 3 times this size, but this is a pretty normal size. This one's not yet ripe. I would not be able to handle it here if it were. The skin is extremely thin, and when the fruit is ripe, your fingers will go right on in. So you want it to already be on a plate before it's fully ripened. These flower at about the same time as most of the other true Annonas. In other words, in the spring, the flowers tend to be fully mature a little later than the majority of the flowers on the Cherimoyas and Cherimoya and sugar apple in the spring, but there is some overlap. And then the fruit set on these stay tiny. A lot of people think they're not going to get any fruit. They're just not looking closely enough, because the base of the flowers, it's only like 1/8 of an inch across the head of the base of the flower. Is if it's still hanging on there, you have fruit set. And then in the fall, it finally starts to thicken up, and depending on the variety of custard apple, Anona reticulata, it'll ripen in February or March or April or early May. So there's several different varieties, and if you like Anona reticulata, custard apple, which I do, I love it, you want to have several varieties with different ripening seasons. These can also be grown for rootstock, but nowadays they're not much used for that because there's sometimes delayed incompatibility between the rootstock and the scion, and the roots are not particularly well suited to flooding or soggy ground, anything like that. So with your Cherimoyas and sugar apple and custard apple and Elamas, if they're not grafted on pond apple, you do want them in very well drained soil. And all the plants should be in full sunlight. Anona reticulata, if it's a good variety, is very smooth, very custardy, as the name implies, custard apple. By the way, that's spelled with a hyphen because it's not an apple, same as pineapples aren't apples. You know, either you have the whole word or you have the word hyphenated. So just English teacher talk there, okay? The custard apple is sweet with a little bit of tartness and a wonderful aroma, if you like it. I do like it. Some people say, oh, I hate perfumy fruit. Well, then they don't like reticulata. The texture with the good ones is extremely creamy, custardy, and the poor ones can be worse than a bad pear, just full of sand. Not actual sand, but grit. It's stone cells. So the good varieties, they say, have just as many stone cells as the bad varieties, but in the good varieties, the stone cells don't clump. So they're so small you don't notice them. But in the bad varieties, you have visible, grit in there. And if you get it in your throat, then you cough. So we keep talking about the variations within species. When you plant the seeds of any of these, if you get seed from a named variety, you call it seedling of. Don't leave off the word seedling, because each of these seeds is a new individual. If it turns out to be a really good one and has noticeably different characteristics from named varieties, then you name it. Put your own name on it, or call it Lovely Sunset, or any other name you want to put on it. And then you have a new named variety. Do not plant seeds from a named variety and call it that variety. Please. Pretty please. Any questions about this or about seeds? Michael?
Do they come very close to the seed or no?
The Sartanaya or Sartaneja or San Pablo, if the trees are grown in isolation and self-pollinate, The seedlings are so similar to the mother tree that we often don't bother to graft them. But they should still be called seedling of, because they might be different. You might somewhere down the line notice that there's a difference in adaptability to the weather, or productivity, or fruit quality, or something that isn't immediately apparent. So it's a good question. Yes, there are some strains of Anona reticulata that are normally sold as seedlings, and sometimes that's even better than grafted trees because the seedlings are more vigorous sooner. They haven't been wounded by being cut into and having to heal to a piece of foreign material and make that grow. So the seedling can bloom right along, may fruit just as soon as a grafted tree or almost as soon, and maybe be more healthy. Now, with many of the other Anona species, the grafting can be more important than with the Anona reticulata. Now, with some varieties of Anona reticulata, such as Tikal or Canul or Fernandez, those are different enough that people have been grafting them to preserve the exact strains because they're very nice. The San Pablo and Sarteneja, I don't consider top-of-the-line varieties, but I consider them highly desirable because they're so productive and trouble-free. Where some of the redder varieties seem to be more prone to various weaknesses. So the natural form of the fruit is green outside and white or cream-colored inside, and those seem to be genetically the strongest trees. But we humans love the really red ones, and we're convinced that the really red ones taste better, with raspberry flavor and so on. And it could be there's actually some component of the flavor that is from the color. But some of us, if we were blindfolded, might not be able to tell the difference. But yes, I like red ones too. They're really lovely. Any other questions about the Anona reticulata, the custard apple?
I was just going to ask you, you kind of hit on it there. I've heard of red ones, green ones. I've seen yellow ones, orange ones, and I've even heard that there might be just like a white one. Can you speak to the different colors and how they differ other than?
I think I've seen every color of the rainbow on Anona reticulata other than blue.
Is there a big difference, why? Yeah, like you said, most people like the red ones, but if you had a yellow one, is that going to taste a whole heck of a lot different than a red one, or?
Some of them have stems like my little finger. Some have stems bigger than my thumb, and look like a World War I grenade. Remember those long wooden handles and a smallish ball on the end that they could throw a really long ways in the battlefields of World War I. So I've seen Anona reticulata that really look like that, and not at all like this more normal shape. I didn't get to taste the grenade-looking one, so can't comment further about that. Speaking of custard apples, in different countries, people take common names and use them differently. So I have this book from Australia, Growing Custard Apples. It's the finest text that I know of for growing Annonas. It is out of print. There is a more recent edition in 3-ring binder notebook format that I think is still available, but you can download that on the internet. So Growing Custard Apple by Sanevsky and all in Australia is something that you should download for your records. You'll have, you won't have some of the things that I'm telling you, but a lot of what I am telling you, you'll find in this book. In fact, I reviewed this book this afternoon to help prepare for the lecture. But notice the title, Growing Custard Apples. It isn't actually talking about what we call custard apples. It's talking about Annonaceae. But Australians call Annonaceae custard apple. And in some of the other countries, they'll call it any Anona custard apple. Larry.
Back about in the mid-90s, we were visiting Bill Lassard's banana farm down in the Redlands, and he really talked about a Mona Lisa variety of custard apple, a red one. And it took me a few years to find it. I grew it for 4 or 5 years, had a big crop on it, but not one edible fruit because they had all, they all mummified because they had the little exit holes from the little fly. Or is that common with custard apple?
Yes, and you brought it up at an appropriate time in the lecture. The Chalcid wasp, some people call it Chalcid fly, that's actually an old name. Nowadays we usually say Annonaceae borer. So when Anona fruits, most any of these species are about thumbnail size, smaller than a quarter, more like a nickel size. The adult Annonaceae borer comes and sits on the fruit. First it recognizes that round shape, this is important, and sits there on the fruit, and it has a very long tube out its rear called an ovipositor. That means an egg positioner, or egg layer. And it will drill down into the fruit. Somehow it can sense when it drills into a seed, which at that point doesn't have any hard skin on it. But it'll lay one egg in that very early stage of the seed, draw that ovipositor out, stick it in again, and lay another egg in another seed. Now, if it does too many seeds, the plant is going to sense, as I say, the processing of information will be going on somewhere in the stem of the fruit or there nearby. And there will be some sort of a hormonal message sensed that there are no longer any viable seeds forming in that fruit. So then what should the plant do? Not waste its energy, right? So it's going to cut off circulation to the fruit. So this is based on information. Not information that the leaves know about, not information that the roots know about, not information that the flowers know about, but the stem of the fruit, or somewhere there, perceives that information and acts upon it and closes off all nutrients to the fruit, so the fruit mummifies. So this is a good thing. You're killing off those pests, those seed borer babies, embryos or larvae are going to die because there's no longer any nourishment in that fruit. And the plant isn't going to waste energy on a fruit that's not going to propagate the plant, to make babies of the plant. Now, if only a certain number of the seeds are penetrated and have the embryos of the Annonaceae borer developing in there, then the plant doesn't get a strong enough message to abort the fruit. So the fruit continues to develop. The Annonaceae borer larvae get big enough and go into a pupal stage, eventually break out of the pupa and drill a hole out through the now hard skin of the seed, coat of the seed, drill out through the pulp, which is not yet ripe. They can't drill through juicy pulp. The pulp still has to be firm. Drill out through the skin, and when the Annonaceae borer gets outside the fruit, it opens its wings to dry. And then it does not know how to bore anymore. Now, if you have put a bag on the fruit, preferably you have bagged the fruit with use woman's hose or make bags from curtains. Sorry, I forget the name of the textile, but those glossy looking see-through curtains. Make fine bags. You can put a drawstring on the end, and you want to get that on the fruit, before the fruit is nickel-sized. So you can't tie the bag to the stem of the fruit. You tie it to the backside of the branch. And the Annonaceae borer adult flying by will not see a round shape and will not even try to get into the bag. So the bag doesn't even have to be well sealed. It's doing its job. If you got the bag on too late and the Annonaceae borers are already in there, when they get to the outside of the fruit and open their wings to dry, then they're trapped inside the bag. So you can still come along and kill them by pinching them, or just let them die from starvation, and you're helping control the pest. Now, the reason why it's important that we bring this up with Anona reticulata is that the fruits of custard apple, of Anona reticulata, ripen in the spring. Most of the other Anona fruits ripen in the fall. Now, if your Annonaceae borers are inside custard apple fruit, they are protected from the winter. And so the Anona reticulata is a harboring host, and when the seed borers come out of it, then they'll infect all your other Anona fruits. So some people don't want to have an Anona reticulata to break the cycle of the Annonaceae borers in their yard, to not have as many around. There'll probably still a few come in on the wind from some neighbor's tree, but you won't have as many seed borers, and maybe you won't have any at all if you don't have an Anona reticulata. Well, I like Anona reticulata too much to go that route. I would just make sure I bag all my Anona reticulata, whether I bag the other species or not. You can buy bags from China. I've never done that. I think the minimum order is something like 100,000 bags. So, this would be something for a club to buy and break up and sell to other clubs, and all the members of the club and all have, 100 or so bags. They can be reused. So that's a project someone might want to take on.
I think you can buy them on Amazon now. Yeah, they're cheap.
Rob says you can find them on Amazon. Yeah. Yeah. But they're from China. Yeah.
Is that the same bug that you see in the papaya plants?
No, not the same bugs as the pack papayas. In the name, it's Annonaceae borer. Now, I know that doesn't automatically exclude it from other things. I will talk now. Oh, yeah. Here's a mummified sugar apple. So I need to talk about other causes of mummification, but we're still talking about this one. I'll get back to it in a minute, but I started talking about another insect now called potato potato leafhopper. And even though it specifically says potato, the potato leafhoppers do attack a wide range of plants, including many of the Annonas. And you'll see leaves that look yellow and burnt along the edges and small. And although it looks like mineral deficiencies, which in some cases it is, but more likely it's the intoxication from the injections from the saliva of the potato leafhoppers. And they attack the younger leaves, and the leaves usually curl downward and make a nice shelter for the potato leafhoppers to live under the curled leaf. They do not like heavy rains. They proliferate in the springtime when it's dry. So the potato leafhopper and the Annonaceae borers are our two main insect pests with Annonas. We do get mealybugs and aphids and so on, but those are usually minor issues. But the leafhoppers in the spring, and also in the spring, the seed borers, we do have to worry about those, or we can lose the entire crop. Okay, back to mummification. So there are other causes of mummification. If there are too many fruits on the tree, this can occur naturally, or it can occur by humans getting gung-ho and hand-pollinating every last flower, which is dumb. But I've done it. Now, when you choose flowers to hand-pollinate, if there's several flowers in the cluster, you pollinate just one flower there. I usually tie grafting rubber on the flowers, so I know it's been done. And you choose positions on branches. So we don't have a lot of branches to work with here, but let's say there's a flower right here. Well, that's a nice spot to pollinate. But if there's a flower way up here, that's not a nice spot to pollinate. You know, the plant's not prepared to hold the weight up there. And so a plant like this really is too young to fruit, but if you insist, you could have it hold 1 or 2 fruits. So this is a stronger stem over here. Let's say you pollinate one flower here and one over here. Maybe one here, that's kind of pushing it. And then you don't do the rest of the flowers. If the tree is just completely full of fruit set, there's no way it can make all those fruit full size because the tree doesn't have that many resources, that much glucose, or that much minerals to provide for those fruits to be full size, but also the tree probably is not going to be able to hold the weight if they get fruit size. So now is a good time for the tree to mummify some fruits. Any question about that?
If you don't pollinate the tree, if it naturally has several fruits and it's still a young tree, will you take some out?
Yes, if the bugs pollinate too many flowers and your tree is young and spindly, I would cut the fruit off. Let the poor plant grow. You can also have mummification of fruit if the plant doesn't have ready access to enough calcium or zinc or boron or some of the other nutrients. You can also get mummification of fruits if the fruit gets injured by rubbing in the wind or a bird peck or something like that, and then a fungus or bacteria get in through the opening and destroy the fruit. So if the plant perceives that, the fruit will mummify. If the plant doesn't perceive it, the fruit may, rot there and spoil, but not make a dried mummified fruit. I think I've covered the causes of mummification, but you see, when someone asks me that question, you know, I have to have enough time and I have to have the patience to listen to a bunch of stuff. How are we doing for time, Rob?
Okay, but don't spend too much time.
Sugar apple, Anona. You can plant seeds of sugar apple and get fruits sometimes within a year and a half. That's kind of unusual, but within 2.5 years, it's quite common to have fruits on seedlings, you know, non-grafted plants of sugar apple. And they fruit around August. These are extremely sensitive to any kind of muddiness in the soil, and they easily die from southern wilt. Now, if you're thinking of buying a property to plant sugar apples, even some of the other Annonas like Cherimoyas, please don't buy a tomato field. If the tomatoes have died from southern bacterial wilt, that remains in the soil for a decade or so and will kill your Annonas from the roots up.
All of them? All varieties?
Sugar apple.
Oh, just sugar apple.
Yeah, that's one reason why sugar apples are not a top preference for grafting onto, as you know, sugar apples rootstocks. Now they're very easy to graft onto. The grafts will grow well, and the tree will be kind of dwarfish, which a lot of people want. If it's a very well-drained location and no Solanaceae plants were grown there before that got sick, like tomatoes or potatoes or eggplant or peppers, then the sugar apple may work quite well as a rootstock long term. Sometimes there's delayed incompatibility with the grafts. Any questions? I think I need to speed up here. I spent quite a bit of time on Annonaceae toxins for cancer. Another of my favorite fruits looks a lot like custard apple. In fact, sometimes I've not been able to tell which the tree was. The trunk usually looks a little whiter and a little smoother than custard apple. This is what I call Amazon custard apple. A lot of people just call it Rolinia. I don't like that because Rolinia is a whole genus with more than 45 species in it. This is the most important of the species. Not that. I can yell. So the Amazon custard fruit, some people think it can grow in swamps because it's from the Amazon, right? Well, you should know that much of the Amazon is very hilly, and these grow in the hillsides. I've never seen one growing in a swamp. Now, Amazon custard fruit are usually about this size, like an extra large sugar apple, but Amazon custard fruit can be quite huge. The skin can be sort of smoothish with, valleys in it, or it can have points like 1.5 inches long. So these are variations within the same species. The flavor is a lively, sweet, tart, refreshing flavor, and the texture is so creamy that we call it buttery. You preferably, okay, you preferably, that was a 2-second battery. You preferably eat the Amazon custard fruit when the skin is mostly yellow, but there are few patches of greenish areas left on the skin, and the skin is firm. If you wait till all the green is gone, and instead of green patches, you have black patches on it, it's still perfectly edible, but the texture is very different. It's no longer buttery, it's slimy. And so some dang botanist named it Anona mucosa, mucus. So I hate that name. There is a synonym botanical name, which is Rolinia deliciosa, or deliciosa. In other words, the delicious Rolinia. And if I were growing this for market, guess which name I would put on? Rolinia deliciosa. There's a lot of variation in this species, and botanists have actually put several different species names on, and then others have come along and said, nah, it's all the same species. And so you'll see a list with about 10 botanical binomials there, and according to the current botanist, it's all just one species. And they do prefer to call it Anona mucosa because they say that was the oldest name put on by botanists. So it's not whether it's the most correct name or the nicest name, but just the oldest name. So grow these in full sun locations and well drained, and otherwise treat much like the other species. This is not like sugar apple. You're not going to get fruit in a year and a half or even 2.5 years in most cases. In fact, when these start flowering, so already gone from juvenile stage into adult stage. You know, juvenile plants do not have flowers. Adult plants do. Even though it's gotten to the adult stage, it'll usually flower for at least 2 years, often 3 years, without sending any fruit. It's contributing the male activity, you know, the pollen, to the community. If there are other Rolinia trees around, well then, you know, it's contributing to reproduction that way. But until the trunk, you know, the base of the trunk is like this big around, and the tree has flowered for at least a couple of years, you are unlikely to see any fruit set. So don't go chopping your tree down just because it's flowered a couple of years and hasn't fruited yet. Any questions about that?
I have a couple of varieties of seedlings, and I don't know what kind they are. What countries are they sort of native to? Where are they growing?
The Amazon custard fruit is native to the Amazon region, which is mostly in Brazil, but it's also in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, and Ecuador. And maybe the range extends up into Venezuela. I'm not sure. Yes?
In terms of pH soil, the soil pH, like what does it prefer?
Soil pH. So Rolinia, being from the Amazon, will prefer a low pH. Most areas of the Amazon have a pH somewhere between 3.5, which is like sulfuric acid, and 5.5. So if you plant it in an 8.4 soil, you're going to have yellow leaves. You're going to need to put on chelated micronutrients. Any questions about that? Oh.
I had a tree that fruited finally for the first time, and then the tree just died. Is that common or no?
Any of these Annonas can just up and die out. The worst that I know of for that is the cowitch, which I brought in from Guatemala, and Chris Rollins brought in from Honduras, different varieties, maybe even different closely related species, and almost everything that we planted did beautifully in 7-gallon containers. Some of them were 9 or 10 feet tall, just gorgeous specimens. And after people planted them in the ground, almost all of them were dead within 1 year, and the remainder were dead, within the next couple of years. So I had one in my yard that survived almost 3 years and then hit up and died, just all of it. And when I cut it off near the base, there was discoloring inside the trunk. So I figured mine had been killed by southern bacterial wilt, because there had been some wild solanaceous plants, like Chinese lanternberries, in the yard when I purchased the house. And apparently that area of soil was contaminated. But there has to have been other reasons, because not everyone's yard or field was contaminated with southern bacterial wilt, and yet everybody's cowish trees, that's Anona scleroderma, died.
Can you talk a little bit about like leaf loss on the Rolinia? Like, does it lose its leaves naturally and then grow back, or?
The Rolinia is supposed to be evergreen. It is a little more tolerant of cold than Soursop. You will see a tree staying dormant for 2 or 3 weeks, maybe longer if it's both cold and dry, and then the tree come out of it later. So let's say the Rolinia has a little bit of sense about the cold. As I say, the Amazon custard fruit, or common Rolinia, is one of my favorite fruits because it's so refreshing.
Just one more question with the Rolinia in terms of pests that really target that.
The potato leafhopper attacks them quite badly. The Anona seed borer usually does not.
Real fast, on the Rolinia as well as the Cherimoya, I have almost every time it's put out a leaf flush, it's covered in caterpillars. Covered, completely defoliates the tree. So I'm wondering if you've seen that.
So spray it with bacteria that infects and kills caterpillars and doesn't kill anything else.
BT.
Yeah, BT, which is short for Bacillus or Bacillus thuringiensis.
Yes, sir.
So you can get a product called Dipel that has one strain of that bacteria in there. You can get a product called Thuricide, which has another strain of that same species. And you can get Centauri with yet another strain of that same species of bacteria.
Okay, thank you.
And it doesn't bother anything else. The Elama is another of my favorite Anonas. Zil High Performance Plant sent me several times to Guatemala to bring in selections of Elama from western Guatemala. The season there in western Guatemala is from late July through early September. Almost all the fruit ripened in August. So in that location, the dry season lasts usually through late June or into early July. And there's a rather cold winter, almost subtropical. Usually no freeze, but you get very chilly, low 40s or upward 30s there in the hills of western Guatemala where these grow. So these are adapted to lose their leaves in the winter there and go through a very long dry season and then have a monsoon-like rains in July and August. Here in Florida, when we have the Elama fruit developing at the same time that the fruits do in Guatemala, but if our rainy season starts in May, we will have washed out or even sorry tasting Elamas. If we have a late starting rainy season here in Florida, like starting in mid-June, the fruit will be delicious. Elama is one of the species that we like to graft on pond apple. Not necessarily to plant in wet locations, but it does work for that. But Elama seeds are hard to get to grow. You can plant hundreds of Elama seed and not get a single one to sprout if you don't use special techniques. If when you eat Elama, you get the seeds clean right away and put them in a paper bag, store them at room temperature, preferably with some diatomaceous earth sprinkled in there to keep any grain weevils from getting in there. If you have grain weevils in your flour or cornmeal or whatever in the cupboard, and you don't protect your Elama seeds, when you go to plant your seeds the following year, they'll all have holes in there because the grain weevils will have ruined them all. So you want to have the seed do what they do in Guatemala. Fall at the end of the rainy season, just be on the ground there, dry for months and months and months, including through the cold weather. And then when the rain finally comes in the summertime, the seeds will grow then. So when you plant the seeds too soon, they may not even have developed embryos in them yet, and the seeds will just rot. Now the flavor of these is sweet with some tartness. It's quite refreshing. The pulp can be glistening white or slightly pink or dark red or even purple. The skin color will mostly be variants of gray and brown or maybe a little bit of pink. Some of them are quite pretty pink when they're mature, but by the time they're ripe enough to pick, the skin can be quite ugly at that stage. So Elama fruit tend to be quite unattractive on the outside, but when you cut them open or break them open, they can be really gorgeous inside. And what gets people when I tell them about Elama is never pick an Elama before it has split. We only sell split Elamas in stores, okay? Isn't that weird? If you pick it sooner, well, it's not split yet. It's going to be bland, pasty, and just not a nice fruit. Sorry, you got a perfect looking one. Enjoy that. Elamas are another, like the Rolinia, they need to get some size to them before they're very likely to hold fruit. So even if it's a grafted tree, expect to wait for 4 or 5 years before the fruit. So in case you didn't notice the posters before, here is a properly ripened Elama. You don't see the split fruit? All right. So you memorized that, right? Remember Terry Mason? We never sell a wine before it's time. I was trying to imitate him. Never sell an Elama that isn't split.
Would you be watering them now then, or would you kind of back off? I mean, if they're grafted on, if you have a grafted Elama that's on pond apple, doesn't the pond apple rootstock kind of want to be watered? But
you are correct. Pond apple is not drought hardy. Pond apple usually does not die in drought, but it can be in very poor health and be a very poor rootstock for other species if the roots get too dry.
So right now we're kind of in drought. Should I be watering mine? I guess.
When any of your Annonas, other than the ones that are supposed to be evergreen, like Soursop and Amazon custard fruit, those you want to keep watered, but your sugar apple, your Elama, your Actimoyas, your Cherimoyas, if you're growing of those, they usually don't grow well here, but maybe you'll want to. Any of those, if they've gone naked, they're not needing to be watered now. unless it's springtime and it's time for the leaves to grow. So now, yes, you would be watering them because you want the leaves to be growing. So the fruit should be forming, should be getting bigger on the Elama. It does need some water to get bigger, and there should be leaves on the tree well before the harvest of the fruit. So you need water for the leaves and for the first stage of fruit development. But if you have heavy rains, not only is that more water, but you have cloudy skies, and I think the cloudy skies have more to do with fruit tasting watery than the actual amount of water. Same with mangoes. A lot of people say, when it rains too much, the fruit tastes washed out. Well, it hasn't been sunny enough to make enough glucose to fill the fruits with sugar. So how are they going to be sweet? So it isn't necessarily because there's so much water. It's just that the water was coming from the clouds. Any question about that? Antemoyas. Now with common names, as I say, people do misuse common names, especially a low-informed person. The first Anona he eats may be an Antemoya, and then all Anonas he'll recognize there's some similarity and we'll call them all Antemoyas. That's not correct. An Antemoya is a hybrid between sugar apple and Peruvian Cherimoya. So Anona squamosa and Anona Cherimoya. I have to say Peruvian Cherimoya because Cuban Cherimoya, that is custard apple. So actually I'm saying Cuban Cherimoya. That's custard apple. So Peruvian Cherimoya, or true Cherimoya, is one of the parents of Atemoyas. There again, people without enough information, if they hear that it's an Anona hybrid, they think they can call all the Anona hybrids Atemoya. Please don't do that. The Atemoyas, especially the Gentner, can produce way more pounds of fruit per tree than a typical sugar apple, and way more than Cherimoya, the Peruvian Cherimoyas do here in Florida, because those don't like the weather or the soil here, and certainly don't like the potato leafhoppers. So if you're very careful with your Cherimoya trees, not the Spain variety or one or two others that are a little less sensitive here, and you keep them well sprayed against the potato leafhoppers, you can grow Cherimoyas here, but they're not going to taste as good as ones from Spain or Madeira Island or Chile or Peru or California. But Atemoyas do very well. They take the weather well. They're absolutely delicious, and some of them are super productive, like the Grafting. Some of the Atemoyas will do better with some hand pollination. Back to the subject of pollination. With these plants that are pollinated by nitidolid beetles, which are only like 2 or 3 millimeters long, dark-colored beetles, that get up in the flowers when the flowers are still in. Well, first they have to visit a female flower and not do any pollination, and just hang out there till it turns male. When that same flower goes from female stage to male stage, then there's the pollen that the nitidolid beetles were waiting to eat. But they get some on their bodies, and then the tree shoos those beetles away. Time to go do your job pollinating. The tree drops the petals from the flowers. So the beetles are now out in the open. They're no longer safe. So they go towards the smell of a female stage flower. It has all that sticky area there in the middle over the female parts. And the beetles have some pollen sticking to them, and as they crawl around, That's how the pollen gets there and does its work. The pollen grains sprout and the tube goes down into the ovary, and that's how the plant mating occurs. But those nitidolid beetles are not automatically available. They do not breed in the flowers. Just the adult nitidolid beetles eat the pollen to prolong their lives. They breed by laying eggs in rotting fruit. Not in fruit peels. You need a substantial piece of rotting fruit. So if you have a moldy orange or lemon or grapefruit, something like that, don't donate it to the city. Keep it in your yard. Put it in a bucket somewhere in the yard and let the beetles lay eggs there and have their larvae hatch out from the rotting fruit, and then you have the nitidolids in your yard. So in neighborhoods that keep the whole neighborhood really damnably clean, there won't be any nitidolid beetles. So you will have to do the pollination yourself. In the case of Cherimoyas, or the custard apple, Anona reticulata, or true Cherimoyas, or some Elamas, not most of them, or the Amazon custard fruit, you do the pollination in the evening with the smallest watercolor paintbrush you can find. Get the expensive ones with a horsehair. You don't want nylon bristles. Those are too stiff, too pointy. They injure the tender parts of the flowers, and the pollen doesn't stick to them well anyway. So spend some money, even if it's $10 or $15, on a very tiny watercolor paintbrush, the sort that you would use to paint in eyelashes on a portrait. Okay? And use those to gather your pollen, and when you stick it up in there, you stick it up once, get stickum from the shiny, sticky female area, stick it back in your old-timey film canister or your pill jar or whatever. A bunch of the pollen will stick to the brush now because there's a stickum on there, and then you dab it up gently. You reach down and you get some more, you dab it up some more. Remember how many parts there are, female parts? Between 80 and 120. So how many pollen grains are you trying to get in there? Like at least 60, okay? So that's how proper pollination is done. And if you want nitidolid beetles in a neighborhood that doesn't have any, go beg some rotten fruit off the ground of some friend. Take it home as a treasure. We don't grow northern pawpaws here. I'm just talking about pollination now. Northern pawpaws are in the same family. They only grow well down to about St. Augustine, Florida. Do not survive here in South Florida. But at pollination time, those have red petals that look like meat, and they smell like rotten meat. And the whole point is to fool carrion flies into crawling all over looking for some meat to lay eggs in for their maggots to grow. They never find a place to lay the eggs, but they crawled all over, and then they're dumb enough to go to another flower, and they take the pollen on them, and that's how the northern pawpaws get pollinated. So for precious treasure to take home, that's roadkill. Hopefully your pawpaw trees aren't right next to your house. And this is another hybrid, Mr. Painter's Cherimoya. And this is a properly named hybrid. I actually coined the word Cherimoya because the mother tree was Peruvian Cherimoya, and the father was Anona reticulata. So I got cherry from Cherimoya and lata from the end of reticulata, and put them together and made that word. Why did I do a thing like that? Take it upon myself to add a word to the dictionary. Well, they did the same thing around 100 years ago, inventing the word Atemoya. That didn't come from any language, as is. Ata is one of the words for sugar apple in some countries. In others it is atis, like in Philippines. Sugar apple are called atis. And so they took ata and moya from the last half of Cherimoya. Got it? So they made this new word that way. So I just followed that same routine, made sure that the new word did not look like a Latin species name. And so sometimes from the Latin names and sometimes from the common names, but I coined many different words like that because I was an Anona breeder for over a decade. So Elama is Cherimoya's mother, that's the seed parent, and Elama as the father, or pollen parent, and several others. So those are just examples. I think we've probably run out of time.
Never.
Or we could all listen to you for hours.
Yeah, how long have we gone?
So hard, you never want to stop hard. No, because it's like, you know, all the gold that's come out of his mouth. Thank you, Har. For our next meeting, we're going to be talking about white sapote, because they're all the rage nowadays.